Daniel and I had been best friends since we were 9 years old. I want you to understand what that means. Before anything else, not acquaintances, not work friends, not the kind of people who text on birthdays and call it close. We grew up together in the truest sense. I knew the layout of his childhood bedroom. I knew the way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him versus the performance laugh he used in groups. I knew which memories he carried quietly and which ones he talked about too much to avoid the ones underneath. 23 years of knowing a person builds something that does not have a clean name, something that sits between friendship and family and does not fit neatly into either category. When Daniel stopped answering my messages, I gave it a week before I let myself worry. He had a pattern of going quiet sometimes. Not avoidance exactly. More like a need to reduce input for a while. He would disappear for a few days, come back with a story about a drive he had taken or a book he had finished, and everything would resume as before. I had learned not to read urgency into the silences, but this silence was different in a way I could not immediately name. It stretched past a week, then 2. I called instead of texting, and the calls went straight to voicemail. Not ringing first. Straight to voicemail. Which meant either the phone was off or the phone was gone. I went to his apartment. His neighbor, an older woman who knew him by sight, told me she hadn't seen him come or go in at least 10 days. The mail in his box was backed up enough to be visible through the slot. His sister filed the missing persons report. The police came, looked at the apartment, noted the absence of signs of struggle, and told us the most common explanation for a single man in his late 20s going missing was that he had chosen to go missing. That people did this. That they walked away from their lives for reasons that made sense to them, even when they made no sense to the people left behind. I sat across from the officer who said this and thought about Daniel, about the specific texture of who he was, his attachment to small routines, his chronic inability to leave a conversation without resolving it. His dog, a 7-year-old beagle named Cobb, who he had scheduled care for through a neighbor only 2 days before he disappeared. You do not arrange care for your dog if you are planning to walk away from your life. Nobody wanted to hear that. His parents retreated into a kind of exhausted resignation within a few months. His sister kept in contact with me for a while, but the calls became less frequent as the weeks accumulated and eventually stopped. The world moved on the way the world does, without asking permission, without acknowledging what it was leaving behind. I did not move on. 9 months after Daniel disappeared, his sister called me for the first time in a long while. She had been clearing out his apartment finally, and had found a laptop she did not recognize. Old, battered, held together in one corner with duct tape. She said it had never been connected to his internet account, and she had never seen it before. She did not know what to do with it, and she thought I should have it. I drove to her apartment that same afternoon. The laptop sat on her kitchen table, and I looked at it for a long time before I picked it up. I do not know what I expected to feel. Relief at having something concrete. Dread at what might be on it. What I actually felt was closer to recognition, like the laptop was a thing I had been heading toward for 9 months without knowing it existed. It was password protected. I spent 2 weeks trying combinations before I got in. His mother's middle name combined with the year of a road trip we had taken together at 22. The kind of password that only makes sense to the person who said it and the people who knew them well enough to guess. The desktop was almost empty. A few standard folders. A text document with what appeared to be a partially written letter that stopped mid-sentence and was never finished. And one folder that sat slightly apart from the others, labeled simply with a word I did not recognize as having any significance. Inside the folder were documents, notes in Daniel's handwriting, photographed and uploaded, printed articles with sections underlined, a list of usernames and access codes, a separate document titled simply what I found with a date at the top that was 3 weeks before he disappeared. I opened it. Daniel had been investigating something. He had not told me about it. He had not told anyone, as far as I could determine. He'd been doing it alone and in secret on a laptop he kept hidden, and he had been doing it for at least 4 months before he vanished. The notes were careful and methodical, in the way Daniel always was when he was genuinely engaged with something. He had a habit of treating things that interested him with the seriousness of a researcher, even when they were not serious subjects. The notes I read now were the most serious thing I had ever seen him write. He had been looking into the disappearances of people in our city, not in the way a curious person follows a news story, in the way someone follows a thread they have found a loose end of and cannot stop pulling. He had cross-referenced dates and locations and demographics. He had found a pattern that the official reporting had not identified or had not publicized. Young people, mostly men, mostly without strong local family ties, disappearing at a rate that was statistically improbable if each case was treated as independent. He'd found something that connected several of them, a location, or rather, a set of locations. A series of addresses in the industrial section of the city that appeared across multiple cases in ways that were not obvious, unless you mapped them the way Daniel had mapped them. A warehouse district. 3 specific buildings that came up in the backgrounds of various pieces of information he had assembled. And at the bottom of the document, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, slightly less controlled, he had written a single line. I think I know where they go. Going Thursday to look. The date was 3 weeks before he disappeared. I sat with that document for a long time. Then I started making my own notes. I want to be clear about what I was and was not. I am not an investigator. I'm not trained in anything that would make me useful in a dangerous situation. I am a 32-year-old man who works in logistics and goes to the gym twice a week and has no meaningful experience with anything that the following weeks would require of me. What I had was the knowledge of a person who had known Daniel for 23 years, and the certainty, as solid and immovable as anything I've ever felt, that he had not walked away from his life. I went to the police again. I brought the laptop. I brought the printed notes. I sat across from a different officer this time and laid it all out as clearly as I could. They took the laptop. They told me they would look into it. 3 weeks later, I called to follow up and was told the laptop had been examined and the documents had been reviewed, and there was nothing actionable in what Daniel had written. That his notes were speculative and that the addresses he had identified were legitimate commercial properties with no history of any relevant complaints. They gave me the laptop back, which I do not know what I expected. I think some part of me expected the document to land differently than it did. Expected someone in an official capacity to read what Daniel had written and feel what I felt when I read it. The specific weight of a careful person who had found something real. Instead, I got the laptop back in a manila envelope and a voicemail from the officer saying they were sorry they could not be more helpful. I started going to the warehouse district. Not inside anything, not at first. I drove through it in the evenings, taking different routes, parking in different locations, and watching. I told myself I was just orienting myself, getting a sense of the area. What I was actually doing was looking for something I could not define, but that I would recognize when I saw it. The district was not dramatically sinister. That was the first thing I had to adjust to. It was just a warehouse district, concrete and corrugated metal and loading bays, and the occasional truck moving through. The kind of area that exists in every mid-sized city and that nobody pays particular attention to because there is nothing visually interesting about it. But Daniel had paid attention to it, and Daniel was gone. On my fourth visit, I parked on a side street with a sight line to one of the 3 addresses he had identified and sat there for 2 hours, watching. Nothing moved at the building in question. The loading bay was closed. The side entrance was closed. The parking area was empty. I was almost ready to leave when a black SUV turned in. It did not park at the loading bay. It pulled around to the side of the building and stopped at a door I could not see from my position. I shifted in my seat to get a better angle and managed to see a door being held open. 2 people going in. The SUV staying. 10 minutes later, the SUV left. I wrote down the plate number. Over the next 2 weeks, I went back 8 more times. I saw the black SUV twice more. I saw a different vehicle, a white panel van, 3 times. I photographed the plate numbers. I noted the times. I built a log the way Daniel had built his notes, methodical, careful. I didn't know what I was building toward. Then one evening I came home to find my apartment door unlocked. I had locked it. I lock it every time I leave. I stood in the hallway outside my apartment door for a full minute before I pushed it open. Nothing inside appeared to have been moved or taken, everything where I'd left it. But the specific feeling of the space was different in a way I cannot rationalize, but could not dismiss. Someone had been inside. I called a locksmith that night and had the lock replaced. I bought a simple security camera for the hallway outside my door. I told myself I was being careful and not paranoid. 4 days later, I got a message on an account I used for almost nothing. A secondary email I had created years ago and used for sign-up forms and newsletter subscriptions. Not my real name on the account. Not connected to anything identifiable. The message was 5 words. You should stop looking now. No sender name that meant anything. The account it came from appeared to have been created the same day the message was sent and had sent nothing else. I stared at that message for a long time. They had found a secondary email account I had not used in months, and that was not connected to my name, which meant they had not found me through a simple search, which meant they had either gotten access to a device or found me through a chain of associations I could not immediately trace. I reported the message to the police. I showed them my log of the warehouse visits and the vehicles and the plate numbers. I showed them the email. I sat across from an officer and watched her write things in a notebook and waited for the response I had already learned to expect. She told me to be careful. She told me to avoid the area. She told me that if I received any further contact, I should report it immediately. She did not tell me what they would do with the plate numbers. I went home and sat in my apartment and thought about Daniel going to that warehouse district alone on a Thursday night, 3 weeks before he disappeared. I thought about what he must have found or seen or come close enough to that he was gone by the following month. I thought about the 5 words in the email. You should stop looking now. I moved out of my apartment 2 weeks later. Not far. Another neighborhood in the same city. A building with a different name attached to the lease. I changed my routines. Different routes to work. Different times for everything. I stopped visiting the warehouse district. I did not stop looking. I just changed how I looked. I sent everything I had, the log, the photographs, the plate numbers, the email, Daniel's documents, all of it, to 3 places simultaneously. A journalist whose work I had followed for years and who covered organized crime, a national tip line for cold cases, and a lawyer I found who specialized in cases where official investigations had stalled. The journalist responded within a week. She asked me several careful questions and told me she could not promise anything but that what I had sent her was worth examining further. She asked me not to contact her through normal channels and gave me a different address. That was 4 months ago. I do not know what she has found. I do not know what, if anything, will come of it. I do not know where Daniel is. What I know is that he found something real in that warehouse district. I know it because a secondary email account with no identifying information received a message telling me to stop. I know it because I came home to an unlocked door after weeks of visiting those addresses. I know it because careful, methodical patient Daniel went to look at something on a Thursday and was gone before Monday came. The last line of his document, I think I know where they go. Going Thursday to look. He was so careful about everything, his notes, his research, the way he built his case piece by piece. And then he went alone on a Thursday night without telling anyone what he had found or where exactly he was going. I have asked myself 1,000 times why he did that, why he did not call me, why he did not send himself an email with the specific address before he went. I think I know the answer. I think by the time he decided to go, he was already being watched. I think he knew it and went alone specifically so that whatever happened to him would not happen to anyone else. That is who Daniel was. That is exactly who he was. I am still here. I am still looking. The email account is still monitored, but no further messages have come. The journalist has not published anything yet. The lawyer is reviewing. Some nights I open Daniel's document and read it again from the beginning. The careful handwriting, the patient assembly of information, the line at the end in the slightly different script. Going Thursday to look. I closed the laptop and I sit in whatever room I am in, and I listen to the building around me, every sound, every movement in the hallway. I am still here. I am not going to stop. Marcus and I had been living together for 2 years before he was gone. I want to be precise about that word. Gone. Not moved out. Not transferred to another city for work. Not any of the clean and ordinary explanations that people reach for when a person stops being present in a space they used to occupy. Marcus was gone the way something is gone when it has been removed without warning and without explanation and without leaving anything behind that tells you why. We had met through a shared housing platform when we were both 26. 2 people who needed to split the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in a city that had stopped being affordable for single incomes. We were not close friends before we moved in. We became close after. In the way people do when they share a kitchen and a living room and the specific texture of each other's ordinary days. I knew his schedule, he knew mine. I knew he kept the television too loud, and he knew I kept the refrigerator too organized. 2 years of small knowledge accumulating into something that functioned like genuine familiarity. He left for work on a Wednesday morning at his usual time. I heard him in the kitchen before I was fully awake. The specific sounds of his breakfast routine, the coffee maker, the particular cabinet he always opened twice because he never remembered the first time that the mugs were on the second shelf, not the first. I heard the front door close at 7:40. I lay in bed for another 20 minutes before I got up. That was the last time I heard him. He did not come home that evening. This was not immediately alarming. Marcus sometimes stayed at his girlfriend's apartment without mentioning it in advance. He was not particularly communicative about his whereabouts, and I had stopped expecting him to be. I sent him a message that evening asking if he was coming back that night, partly because I was planning to have a friend over and wanted to know whether to account for him. He did not respond. By Thursday evening, I was mildly concerned. By Friday morning, I was genuinely worried. His girlfriend in Lodz, a woman named Priya, whom I had met a handful of times, called me Friday afternoon asking if I had seen him. She had not heard from him since Tuesday. She had assumed he was with me. We filed the missing persons report together. The police came to the apartment and looked through his room. They asked me the standard questions. Was he having financial difficulties? Had he seemed depressed or anxious recently? Had there been any conflict in his relationships? Were there any debts or legal issues I was aware of? I answered everything as accurately as I could. The officer who took my statement was professional and thorough, and when he left, I had the feeling that he had already internally categorized Marcus as a voluntary disappearance, even before the door closed behind him. The first 2 weeks were a constant, low-level noise of calls and messages and conversations with his family who had driven down from another state and taken over the small logistics of the situation with the focused grief of people who needed something to do. His mother sat in his room for an hour the first day and came out looking like she had aged 5 years. His father went through his financial records methodically and found nothing that explained anything. By the 3rd week, most of that had settled. His family went back. Priya stopped calling daily. The investigation produced nothing visible. The apartment returned to a kind of terrible normalcy in which Marcus was absent, but his things were still present, and the city outside continued with complete indifference. I was alone in the apartment now in a new and different way than I had ever been alone in it before. The first thing I noticed was the sounds. Not dramatic sounds, not footsteps in the night or voices from empty rooms. Small things. The specific sound of the building's heating system cycling on, which I had always heard but now heard differently. The way sound moved between the 2 bedrooms through the shared wall. Things I had cataloged unconsciously over 2 years of shared living, and that my brain now measured compulsively against the baseline of what they had always been. About 3 weeks after Marcus disappeared, I was lying in bed at night, and I heard something from his room. A sound like the floor settling under weight. I lay completely still and listened. The sound came again. The specific creak of the particular floorboard just inside his door that had always announced when he was coming out of his room. I knew that creak. 2 years of knowing it. It had a quality I could have identified in a recording. I got up. I stood in the hallway outside his door and listened. Nothing further. I opened the door and looked into his room. Dark and still. his things exactly where his family had left them. His bed made with the hospital corners his mother had put on when she visited. Nothing moved, nothing disturbed. I stood in the doorway for a long time looking at the room before I went back to bed. I told myself the building was old and old buildings made sounds. And there was nothing in that room. Over the following 2 weeks, I heard it 4 more times. Always at night, always the specific creak of that specific floorboard. Once accompanied by what might have been the quiet settling sound of someone sitting on a bed with a particular kind of care, lowering themselves slowly to minimize noise. I went to his door every time. The room was always empty, always exactly as it had been. I mentioned it to Priya on a phone call, and she went quiet in the way people go quiet when they are deciding whether to say something or not. Then she told me that Marcus had told her something a few months before he disappeared. That he had felt for a while like someone had been in his room, that small things were not where he had left them, that he had mentioned it once and then not mentioned it again, and she had assumed it was stress from work making him paranoid. She had not told the police this because she had not remembered it until I called. I called the police and told them. The officer who answered was not the same one who had taken my original statement. He listened and took down what I said and told me they would add it to the file. That night I set up a simple motion-triggered camera aimed at Marcus's closed door from the hallway, the kind people use to watch for package theft. I told myself it was almost certainly nothing, that I would review empty footage in the morning and feel slightly foolish, and that would be the end of it. I reviewed the footage the next morning, and the camera had triggered twice during the night, both times between 2 and 4 in the morning. Both times the footage showed nothing in the hallway, which meant whatever had triggered the motion sensor had not been visible from the angle the camera was aimed at, or something had triggered it from inside the room. I moved the camera. I aimed it directly at Marcus's door from a lower angle that would catch anything at floor level. I went to bed and lay there and listened to the apartment around me. At 2:17 in the morning, the floorboard creaked. I was awake immediately. I had not been sleeping. I had been lying in the dark, waiting for it with my phone in my hand. I waited 10 seconds and then opened the camera feed on my phone. The footage showed the bottom of Marcus's door, the half-inch gap between the door and the floor, through which a narrow strip of the room's darkness was visible. In that strip, in the gap under the door, was the toe of a shoe. Someone was standing just inside Marcus's door. I did not make a sound. Every part of me went very still in the specific way that happens when the body decides that being quiet and being small is the correct response to the information it has just received. I lay in my bed and watched the camera feed on my phone, and the shoe did not move. Then it moved back, slowly, one step backward away from the door. Then the room was quiet. I called the police from my bed without getting up, whispering my address. I did not go into the hallway. I did not go near Marcus's door. I sat against the headboard of my bed with the camera feed open on my phone and waited for the 23 minutes it took for 2 officers to arrive. They went into Marcus's room. They found the window. The building was old, and Marcus's window looked out onto a narrow alley between our building and the next one. The window had a standard latch that Marcus had always kept closed. The officers found the latch in the closed position, but the frame of the window, old wood that had been painted over many times across many decades, had warped. The latch appeared engaged, but the window could be pushed open from outside with moderate pressure because the wood no longer sat flush in its frame, and pushed closed again from outside with the same pressure, leaving the latch appearing undisturbed. Someone had known this about Marcus's window. Someone had been using Marcus's window to access his room, possibly for months. Possibly for the entire period I had been hearing the floorboards in the night. Possibly for longer than that, for the period Marcus himself had told Priya that small things in his room were not where he left them. The officers dusted the window frame and the sill and found partial prints that were not matched to Marcus in the databases available to them. They photographed everything. They told me to stay somewhere else while further investigation was conducted. I went to a friend's apartment and lay on his couch and looked at the ceiling and thought about the shoe in the gap under the door. The stillness of it. The patience of standing that close to a door behind which someone was awake and watching through a phone camera and not moving, not leaving immediately, just standing still just inside the door, waiting to see if I was going to open it. The investigation found something in the alley below Marcus's window that I was not told about in detail. The officer who spoke with me described it only as materials consistent with someone having spent time in the alley over an extended period. He did not elaborate, and I did not push. What he did tell me was that there was evidence the alley had been used as a point of observation, that from a specific position in the alley, there was a clear sight line to Marcus's window and to a portion of the interior of his room. Someone had been watching Marcus's room from the alley, watching his room, learning his patterns, learning the warped window. And then at some point, they had stopped watching from outside and started coming in. What they had been looking for in Marcus's room, I do not know. The officers could not tell me what, if anything, had been taken or disturbed, because neither they nor I had a clear enough baseline of how Marcus kept his room to identify what might be missing. Marcus kept his room in a specific organized chaos that only he understood. His family had touched things when they visited. I had not been in the room regularly. There was no reliable record of what had been where before he disappeared. The connection between whoever had been accessing his room and his disappearance was never officially established. The investigation remained open. The partial prints were never matched. I broke the lease and moved out within the month. But I've thought about the timeline many times since then. Marcus telling Priya that things in his room were not where he left them months before he disappeared. The floorboard sounds I'd been hearing for weeks after he was gone. The shoe in the gap under the door. The person who had been coming through that window had not stopped when Marcus disappeared. They had kept coming back, which means either they had not found what they were looking for before he was gone, or they were coming back for a different reason entirely. Something that had nothing to do with searching a room and everything to do with being in a space that still held the particular quality of a person who was no longer there. I do not know which of those possibilities is worse. I have not been able to decide. Nina and I had been friends since we were 11 years old. The kind of friendship that forms when two people are thrown together by proximity and then refuses to dissolve when the proximity ends. We grew up 3 houses apart on a street in a suburb that no longer exists the way it did then. We went to the same school, had overlapping, but not identical friend groups, drifted through adolescence and early adulthood in the way people do, and maintained contact across the years through a combination of effort and the specific refusal to let something that mattered fall away. She had moved to a small town about 4 hours from the city where I lived, approximately 18 months before the events I'm going to describe. A relationship had brought her there initially. The relationship had ended, but the town had suited her in ways the city never quite had. She worked remotely, had a small house at the edge of a rural area, kept a garden, and described the place in our phone calls with a contentment that seemed genuine and hard-won rather than performed. We called each other every 10 days or 2 weeks, not rigidly scheduled, just the natural rhythm that had established itself over years. Sometimes we would go 3 weeks without talking if life was particularly full for one of us, but there was always a return, always a catch-up call that picked up mid-conversation, as if the gap had not existed. The gap that preceded this story was 5 weeks. I noticed it at 3 weeks, but told myself she was busy. At 4 weeks, I sent a text that went unanswered and told myself she was having a difficult period and would reach out when she was ready. At 5 weeks, something shifted in me, and I stopped rationalizing and started paying attention to the quality of the silence rather than its duration. It was different. Nina's silences had a texture I had learned over 20 years. They were warm absences, if that makes sense. The sense of a person who was present in the world and simply occupied with something other than contact. This silence had a different quality. It felt thin, like something was missing from the frequency on which I usually sensed her. I called the number 4 times over the course of a week. Each call went to voicemail after a standard number of rings, which meant the phone was on. She was not answering, but the phone was functioning. I left 2 messages, nothing dramatic. Just her name and mine, and a request to call when she had a chance. No response. I called the number she had given me for her neighbor, an older woman named Barbara who had a key to her house and who she had mentioned as the person to contact in an emergency. Barbara answered on the second ring, and her voice when I explained who I was and what I was calling about had a quality that I registered immediately, but could not immediately interpret. She told me Nina was fine as far as she knew. She said it in a way that added the as far as she knew at the end, like something she had thought about before speaking, like a qualifier she had chosen carefully. I asked when she had last seen Nina. A pause, just long enough to be noticeable. She said she thought it had been about 2 weeks, maybe a little longer. She said Nina kept mostly to herself, and that was her nature, and there was nothing unusual about not seeing her for a couple of weeks. I asked if she had been inside the house recently. Another pause, shorter this time. She said she had not had any reason to go inside. She said Nina was a private person and she respected that. I thanked her and ended the call and sat with the quality of that conversation for a while. The pauses, the qualifiers, the specific way someone sounds when they are telling you something technically accurate that is designed to prevent you from understanding something else. I drove to the town the following Saturday morning, 4 hours. I had made the drive twice before to visit Nina in the time since she had moved there. I knew the route. I knew the exit off the highway. I knew the stretch of rural road that connected the main road to her street. I had called ahead both previous times. This time I had not told anyone I was coming because I had an instinct, not fully formed, just a direction of feeling that announcing my arrival would cause something to adjust before I got there. The town looked the same as I remembered it, small, quiet. The main street, with its particular collection of businesses that small towns accumulate over decades. A hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a real estate office, a bar that doubled as a restaurant on weekend evenings. A few people on the street who looked up when my car passed with a specific, brief attention of people in places where unfamiliar cars are noticed. I drove directly to Nina's house. It was a small wooden structure, set back from the road, with a gravel driveway and a garden along the right side that Nina had worked hard on in the time she had lived there. The garden was overgrown, not dramatically, not in the way of months of neglect, but in the way of a few weeks of nobody tending it, the particular sprawl of plants that have missed their regular attention. Her car was in the driveway. I knocked at the front door, waited, knocked again. Nothing. I went around to the back and knocked at the back door. Nothing. I looked through the kitchen window. The kitchen was visible and looked ordinary. Nothing on the counter that should not be there. A dish in the drying rack beside the sink that had been there long enough to be completely dry. I went back to my car and sat in the driveway for a while trying to decide what to do. Then I went to Barbara's house. She answered the door, and when she saw me, her face did something complicated. Not surprise exactly. Something that looked more like a reckoning. Like she had been expecting something and was not certain whether this was it. I told her I'd driven 4 hours and that I needed to know what was actually happening. She stood in her doorway and looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped back and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table and she made tea she did not drink and I did not drink, and she told me what she knew, or rather she told me what she had observed, which was a different and more careful thing. Nina had not been herself for approximately the last 6 weeks. Barbara was not certain exactly when it had started, but she had first noticed something was off when she saw Nina outside one evening. And Nina had walked back inside without acknowledging her wave from across the yards. This was unusual. Nina was not unfriendly. They were not close, but they were the kind of neighbors who waved and exchanged a few words regularly, and Nina had always initiated those exchanges as readily as Barbara had. Over the following weeks, Barbara had seen Nina less frequently. When she did see her, Nina seemed to be moving differently, keeping her head down, moving quickly between the house and the car, not stopping. Barbara had knocked on the door twice to check in. Both times Nina had come to the door but had not opened it fully and had spoken through the gap and had said she was fine and she was just busy and she would come by for a proper visit soon. Both times Barbara had left with the feeling, the same feeling I had heard in her voice on the phone, that the words and the reality were not the same thing. I asked her if she had any idea what might have changed 6 weeks ago. She thought about this for a long time. Then she told me about the man. She hadn't told me about him on the phone because she had not been certain it was relevant. She was still not certain it was relevant. She did not want to cause alarm if there was a simple explanation. But since I had driven 4 hours, she felt I deserved what she actually knew. Approximately 7 weeks ago, she had noticed a man she did not recognize spending time in the area around Nina's house. Not at the house exactly, but nearby, walking along the road in front of it, sitting in a car parked a short distance down the street for extended periods on at least 2 occasions she could confirm. The man was in his 40s, she estimated. She had only seen him from a distance. He drove a dark gray car that she could not identify further than that. She did not know if Nina was aware of him. She hadn't mentioned him to Nina because she had not been certain she was not simply noticing a neighbor she had never paid attention to before. But then Nina had changed, and she had thought about the man, and she had wondered. She had not told the police because she did not know that there was anything to tell. Nothing had happened that she could articulate as an event. A woman who seemed quieter than usual. A man she did not recognize spending time in the vicinity. Nothing that would constitute a report. I sat at Barbara's kitchen table and thought about 6 weeks. The man had appeared approximately 7 weeks ago. Nina had changed approximately 6 weeks ago. Nina had stopped answering my calls approximately 5 weeks ago. The sequence of it sat in my chest, like something with weight. I thanked Barbara and went back to my car. I parked in front of Nina's house, and I called her number and listened to it ring through to voicemail. I left a message telling her I was in her driveway, and I was going to sit there until she came out or until something else happened and that I was not leaving. I sat there for 40 minutes. Then the front door opened. Nina came out and walked down the driveway and got into the passenger seat of my car and closed the door and sat looking straight ahead through the windshield without saying anything for a long moment. She had lost weight, not dramatically, but noticeably, on someone I had known for 20 years. There were circles under her eyes that spoke of weeks of poor sleep. She was holding herself in a particular way, shoulders slightly forward, arms close to her body, that I had never seen from her before. The specific posture of someone who has been trying to take up less space. I did not say anything. I waited. She said his name was, or at least he had told her his name was Thomas. She said she had met him in the town at the diner on the main street about 2 months ago. He had sat at the counter beside her and they had talked for an hour, and he had been interesting and attentive, and she had thought he was simply a person passing through. He had not been passing through. She had seen him again a week later, and the week after that. And each time he had appeared in a place she was, in a town small enough that appearing in the same places regularly could be coincidence, and each time he had been friendly and engaging and had not done anything she could concretely identify as wrong. Then she had noticed the car, parked at the edge of her road on a Tuesday evening when she came home from the grocery store. The same car the following Thursday morning when she left for a walk. Outside the diner on a Friday when she went in for coffee, parked across the street at an angle that gave a clear view of the entrance. She had gone to the local police. The officer she spoke with had listened and had taken down her information and had told her what officers in small towns tell people who come in with concerns about someone whose behavior has not technically crossed any line. That unless he had made contact that was threatening or had violated any property or any explicit boundary, there was limited action they could take. That he had as much right to be in those places as she did. That she should keep a log and return if anything escalated. She had gone home and tried to take the officer's advice and think about it rationally. She had told herself she was living alone in a rural area, and that was making her more sensitive than the situation warranted. She had tried to continue her life as normally as she could. Then she had found the photograph. She had come home one afternoon and found a photograph in her mailbox. No envelope, no note. Just a photograph printed on ordinary paper. A photograph of her in her garden, taken from a distance, and at an angle that indicated it had been taken from the road or from the property boundary. She was bent over one of the garden beds and was clearly unaware she was being photographed. The photograph was from approximately 3 weeks ago. She hadn't gone back to the police. She had not called me. She had gone inside and locked the doors and drawn the curtains and had been living in the house as quietly as she could manage, going out only when necessary, answering the door only for deliveries she could confirm through the window, keeping her phone calls brief and minimal. She had not called me because she did not know what I could do, and she had not wanted to pull anyone else into it. I sat in the passenger seat of my car in her driveway and looked at her and thought about 6 weeks of this. 6 weeks of being alone in a small house in a small town with a photograph in the mailbox and curtains drawn and trying to make herself as invisible as possible while the days accumulated around her. I took the photograph to the police myself. I was not from this town and I had no standing there, and the officer I spoke with was the same officer Nina had spoken with. He looked at the photograph and he looked at me and he said what he had said before about the limitations of what they could act on. I asked him directly whether he knew who Thomas was. A pause in his expression that was very small, but that I caught. A fraction of a second in which something moved behind his eyes that was not the blankness of someone who had no information. He said he did not know who I was referring to. I described the man as Barbara had described him to me. Mid-40s, dark gray car, seen in the vicinity of Nina's property on multiple occasions. The officer said he could not help me with that description. I went back to Nina's house, and I called the county sheriff's office from her kitchen. I told them everything from the beginning. The photograph, the car, the timeline, Barbara's account of the man outside the house, the date the behavior had started and the date Nina had stopped being herself, and the date she had stopped answering calls. The county sheriff's office sent someone the following morning, a deputy who was not from the town, who came and sat in Nina's living room and listened to everything from the beginning without the particular resistance I had encountered at the town level, who took the photograph and photographed Barbara's account, and who, when I described the local officer's response to the information I had given him, wrote something down with an attention that suggested he was writing down more than the content of what I was saying. I do not know what the deputy found when he made his inquiries. Nina did not tell me in detail, and I did not push her for detail in the days that followed, because she was exhausted in a way that deserved rest more than it deserved further conversation. What I know is that the dark gray car was not seen in the area again after the deputy's visit. What I know is that the town's officer was reassigned to a different district within a month of my report to the county office. What I know is that Nina sold her house 4 months later and moved to a city several states away, and that she did not tell anyone in that town where she was going. We speak on the phone regularly, every 10 days or 2 weeks, the rhythm restored. But the conversations have a quality now that they did not have before. A thing in her voice when certain subjects come up that was not there before any of this. The specific quality of someone who's been shown that the distance between ordinary life and something else is smaller than they understood. She kept the photograph. I asked her once why she kept it. She said because it was real and she needed to be able to look at it sometimes to remind herself that she had not imagined any of it. That the 6 weeks of drawn curtains and locked doors and watching the road from windows was not a response to something she had manufactured in her own mind. That someone had stood at the edge of her property with a camera. That the photograph was proof. I understand why she keeps it. Some things you need to be able to look at to remember they were real. Because the alternative, the possibility that you might one day convince yourself it wasn't, is worse than the image itself. Some doors cannot be unknocked once they have been knocked. Some distances once shown to be smaller than you thought cannot be made large again. Nina is safe. She is somewhere else now. She is sleeping better. She told me so last week. I believe her. But I also remember sitting in my car in her driveway for 40 minutes, watching her front door and thinking about the photograph in the mailbox. About someone standing at her garden boundary with a camera, about the weeks she had spent alone in that house, with the curtains closed, trying to make herself small enough to be overlooked. And I think about what would have happened if I had accepted the silence, if I had told myself she was busy and that 3 weeks would become 4 and 4 would become 5 and eventually she would call and everything would be fine. If I had not driven 4 hours on a Saturday morning without telling anyone I was coming. Some silences are just silences, and some silences are someone who has drawn the curtains and locked the doors and is hoping that staying quiet is enough. You have to know the difference. 3 stories closed for tonight. If these reached you somewhere that took a moment to name, good. That is the right response. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Mr. Night Files is here every week. Real people. Real silences that turned out to mean something. Share this with someone who has a friend they have not heard from in a while and have been meaning to check on. Do it tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. One last thing before you go. The next time someone you know goes quiet in a way that feels different from their usual quiet, do not wait to see if it resolves itself. Call. Drive if you have to. Be the person who showed up. I will see you in the next file. If you make it there.